So we're going to talk about designing book covers and comic book covers in particular. So there's lots of different, ways to talk about it. There's lots and lots and lots of different kinds of designs. We're going to talk about old designs as well as more modern designs and so on. So let's just jump in. So when comic book artists create a cover for a book, they use size and location to show the hierarchy of information. So what is hierarchy of information? Does anyone have any idea of what that might mean? Hierarchy of information? Will Hendricks, what do you think?
Kind of like what you're seeing first and where you want the person to see, like
What
the
they see
direction.
next? Yes. So kind of like an order of what, and then what happens when you have an order of information, you associate the first thing you saw with the next thing you see. So that's very important to create a full message. So that's integral to design in general, not just to comic books. So bigger blocks of text are very noticeable and they're considered important. So the bigger the type, the more important it might be. The higher a block of text is on the cover, the more important it is as well. So in this case, the title is the most important, so it is big and near the top. The name of the writers and the artists are less important, so they are smaller and near the bottom. So there's different types of designs, and this one is called the Z design, letter Z. Artists also use several organizational schemes to guide the reader's eye. So you think of it like a flow. When we looked at that image of the panels with the Native American girl who was on her knees looking up at the eagle, and how we kind of went down that big long panel and then kind of came back and went down through the rest of the panels. So there was a very particular flow as to how it all worked. And that's what artists do with these kinds of designs as well. So here we see the type is at the top and we have Green Lantern. We read that and then we've got that, rocket kind of coming towards Green Lantern. He's, trying to take it out and he's got his legs in this long position. And so if we look at it, we can almost see like the letter Z. And here's another example of that. So here we have the Silver Surfer and there he is small like a surfboard. So a surfboard acts as a directional and it literally is coming back, and then there's his hands and, all of the way he's kind of, looking at you is very ominous. And so we have all this information that kind of forms that Z. Here's another one, Marvel Comics, the Wolverine, and there just by the action of his body and the way his hair is flying, it creates that diagonal line. And then of course the stop of information at the bottom gives us like a stop point, which then gives us a horizontal. So we have the words as horizontal, the directional image that's a diagonal, and then the stop at the bottom. And then back to the first one we saw, that was Astro City. And so that one really does have all of these forms, they're all coming back, like flying at this diagonal. The name at the top is very large, so it's the first place we're going to look. One thing I've talked about before in other classes, I think I've mentioned it here, is that once you learn how to read, you can't not read. It's a really interesting concept. So when you see something, you pretty much have to read it if you know how to read. It's like you're kind of controlled by it. You're sort of under the power of having to be literate. And so we see Astro City, we have to read it, especially when it's so big like that. And then we come down and then we see the names of the writers and the artists and so on. So we're forming another Z. Another shape is called the V shape. And this is an older comic book, all-star comic book. It's quite old. And there we see all the characters in this sort of victory kind of position. Here's a Wolverine, same kind of situation where the shape of his body literally forms the V. And then there's another type that's called the central focal point. So in other words, we're kind of looking at a sort of perspective. So anybody who's taken 2D composition with me or 2D composition in general, there's a deep space project where you do a center point or some sort of vanishing point, and then you have everything flying from or to that point. And so that's the kind of what's happening in this particular situation where we've got everything sort of flying out from this vanishing point. And then we even have like the X-Men are going at an angle, the Uncanny X-Men, again, this is an older comic book. Here's another central point, and they're kind of coming from where the two characters are together. And so how the buildings are all sort of kind of folding into that point. We see the earth in the background, explosions, that red, the glowing red from his eyes. I mean, all of the stuff is sort of moving to that one point. And then we have the left-hand column. So this is again an older style where you see like previews of what's going to be inside the comic book, maybe talking about future stories that have to do with this one. This is Marvel Tales. There we have like this big scene in the middle, but then we have these little bits, like little vignettes over on the left-hand column. They use that a lot in these classic stories. So this was a whole period of comic books that in the 1950s, and I don't think they were in the 40s. It was pretty much the 1950s and maybe early 60s, but mostly the 1950s, where they looked at, stories like Robin Hood or, Treasure Island or piracy or whatever. In fact, I have probably about 100 of those, and it would be fun sometime if people want to see them, I can bring them in. But they're all these like actual stories that were then condensed down by artists into comic books. And so there we have, the left-hand column, the ship is happy, sailing, everything's fine. And then we look at the big main picture, and what do we have? He's shipwrecked, and he's on a lifeboat. And so obviously something bad happened. Another thing we're seeing in more modern comic books, and different than what we saw in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s even, and maybe into the early 90s, we start to see a lack of color. And we start to see comic books that are kind of going into almost like a grayscale or just very minimal color that's very carefully painted into the image. So monochromatic tones, contrasting colors, or the use of just one bold color along with some black or white make up some of the probably my most favorite covers. Even when they come in totally different styles, color alone helps distinguish the best of the best. Boldness requires that the artist chooses to go with a whole lot of white. And that's scary, because if you don't know how to use white space, you feel like I've got to put in more and more and more and more. I've just got to fill it up. Now that's a style and you can do that, but I want to show you that there's many different kinds of styles. So white is not for the faint of heart. You've really got to know how to use it. And you can see that these are all very successful in the way that they've developed the use of white space. And it makes for really striking covers because you really are looking. Sometimes less really is more. So composition, how do we compose things? So in the ones we saw, the early comic books, the more, the kind of historical comic books, there were very specific styles that they used. But now it's kind of, because of digital media, it's all wide open. And so people can do all kinds of things. So I want to look at what I think are some very interesting compositions. So people are often swayed by excellent compositions. When there's a good composition, it makes you want to look more. So interesting positive and negative space is a must. So like in the first one, we can see how the sky, is really kind of just a background to where all the type goes and everything. And then there's this sort of tilting horizon line, and then all the characters kind of pushed down into a corner. Really interesting use of space. But to be able to use positive and negative space, you really have to execute it well. It's not always the easiest thing to do. And sometimes you have to use a little bit of restraint. It's interesting angles, off-center compositions, the illusion of movement, all of those, are important. So if we kind of go through some of these, I really like the Batwoman one. Now what happened here is they created an entire scene. So like this is something you could do with your perspective tool, and you create all of the buildings and so forth. And then there's Batwoman kind of leaning over the cornice of a building, and she's the only real red except for the red in the hospital, right? So the red cross in the hospital, and then the red in her name. And then they took like a blur tool and went over the top and gave it the essence of rain, which I just think is super fun. Rage More, and there we've got like the Rock Man, and he's getting pulled in by the octopus, and we've got the bubbles of like, are they bubbles of the air? Are they rock? Is he being pulled apart? And all of that kind of, rising to the surface. The Princess of Mars up in the top corner, again, the idea of the octopus. And what's interesting about this octopus is if you look at like the tentacles and the little suckers that are on the tentacles, some of them are just sort of randomly thrown in there, to say like, yeah, there's a lot, there's just a lot. Like you can see the little curlicue ones that are in the way background that are really small, but see how they're all wrapped around the character. The Black Widow, again, a really interesting composition because, you've got this really, like, remember we talked about 3-point perspective being on the top of the building. And so that's what we're seeing here is the top of the building, 3-point perspective. We've got the character like, kind of reaching out towards us, this wonderful foreshortening going on. And there she's holding on to someone for dear life. Very interesting composition. So graphic composition. So there's another type of design that is very graphic. It doesn't make the characters look very realistic sometimes. They're almost like cut out pieces of paper, and that would be like a silk screen effect. And so here it's another compositional trick that we've been seeing a surge over the last maybe 15 years or so. It's a heavy influence of strong graphic design and sensibility in covers. J.H. William III is easily one of the standouts here, but we also see a lot of stunning examples and very cool offerings from John Cassidy, James Jean, and David Aja, among many others. And so, you can see here Batgirl and how the character that's under her almost sort of fades into, like it's got some, like three-dimensionality to it in maybe the hands, but then it's like the bottom part of him just sort of folds into like almost like cut paper. Same thing with Hawkeye. That is all just very, very, very graphic. It's a lot of white space, got the arrows coming in, the silhouettes of the characters, inside of the arrows and so on. Another really nice Batwoman. And also notice like the Batwoman that we just saw and the Batwoman that we're looking here. A lot of these comic books, when they create their masthead, so the name Batwoman, that would be the masthead. So a magazine like Esquire or Vanity Fair or the New York Times or whatever, they have what's called a masthead. And that means they use that same type. And most of the time they use the same size over and over and over again. So it's automatically recognizable. And that's what we have here with Batwoman. So this is her masthead. And then she's kind of a center V design. And you can see the vision of the Batman kind of behind her, but then there's her with her red hair and flames and everything coming out. And then we also see like these little graphic elements down at the bottom and even hand-drawn elements, like the side of the building with the hawk there. I mean, it's just real kind of interesting the way that the artist composed all of these different bits. Xanadu, very scary stuff. We've got a little bit of a left-hand column happening there, but then we have this sort of psychedelic background, this really kind of 1960s looking typeface, Madame Xanadu, and, something obviously very awful because she looks like she's going to eat a skull. And Amazing Spider-Man, really a kind of a deviation from some of the Spider-Man comic covers that we'd seen in the past, where we're using only 2 colors, very interesting. Same thing with the planetary machine. And again, very graphic, very 1960s psychedelic almost. Okay. So text integration, that's another area I think that we have to look at, and that's where the text starts to actually integrate with the image. So here we can see a compositional trick that's also has had a kind of a big surge, and that's this, oh, it looks like I didn't get to go. Oh, sorry about that, guys. Something's happening with my computer here. There we go. So there we can see some of our text integration. So I really like these Fairest and the fables, the way that they kind of just recreated things. So they're not going to the type at the top anymore, because a lot of comic books nowadays are digital. And so remember earlier we talked about why is the type at the top? Well, because it's kind of the way we write. So we have this convention that we start at the top and we read from left to right and then we go down. So it was just common for us to be able to have the type at the top. But because they're digital comic books and they're not necessarily going to be in a comic store, and they're not going to have, be sitting in a rack where you only get to see the top and then you have to pull it out to see the rest of the picture. People are willing to play a lot more with the way that they use type. So 6 Hours to Kill, you can see how it's all kind of woven into her hair. Deviate, really strong graphics, gods and monsters, like right in the middle of the page. Fables, again, different. You can see that they're not sticking to the idea of a masthead. And there we have it like kind of falling down and like literally falling off the page, or this other piece, where the girl and the image are sort of blended together. DMZ is a wonderful combination of using very graphic images and graphic lettering, and still creates a sense of hierarchy because it's so large. So when we start to do things like this, what happens to a lot of things that play in more are the color. So it's not about, just brand recognition anymore. It's like we kind of let go of the brand recognition and we really get to be artists, and we get to change the way that things move around. So I think that's really interesting. I think it actually shows a better design, and it integrates the title into the work. And sometimes it's just a matter of like where the placement is. How do we move it around? So we're actually looking at the illustration and the placement and sort of combining the two together, and not just slapping that brand right on the top, that masthead, always looking the same, slapping it on the top. So I think the whole work then becomes like an illustration, very different. So we also want to look at the content that we see. So this is one of the trickiest, perhaps the most, saltiest, and sometimes we're turned off by things. So many people are turned off by very sexist covers, and like crossing the line is different for everyone. But instant turnoffs are excessive, are things that like focus on excessive male gaze, like for example, zippers that defy the laws of physics, female costumes that absolutely make no sense at all, especially when contrasted with the way that the males are dressed. So these are things that, women especially have started to say, hey, what's up with this? And so the overtly sexual stuff sometimes has no real contextual reason behind it. And so I think that, especially in this day and age, we're starting to see a lot of that pushback on some of that. And one of the artists that did that, that kind of really brought that to the forefront, is this artist. This is she did a whole series of like kind of making fun of the way that comic book covers were made. And here we see the She-Hulk, and that's an actual cover. And then she decided to put Spider-Man in the same position, right? So She-Hulk has superhuman strength and speed and is one of the most formidable hand-to-hand combatants in the Marvel world. And there we have, but how is she dressed? And is it really appropriate? So this artist, also her artwork draws inspiration from comic book covers, but parodies the male superheroes using body language typically associated with women. The results are covers that with familiar characters such as Superman and Batman in strikingly unusual poses and outfits. Whoops, let me go back one. My bad. Oh, too far. There we go. Here we see a scantily clad Spider-Man is pictured with only a thong. That in the very beginning we saw that the Hulk covers himself with a newspaper. Iron Man with the prominent buttocks, crawls on the ledge. Her name is Aurora. She says the female heroines are drawn, would never be applied. The way that they are drawn would never be applied to men, which is true. So part of the problem, she says, is that comic books are very often drawn by men for men to enjoy. And she argues that the current depiction of superheroines exists because of this vicious cycle. Companies decide on a specific target market and then use that demographic as a reason to continue that same problematic process over and over again. She says, I wish comic book publishers would see that there is definitely a market for more inclusive comic books. And there we see another one of her things. And then here, her project was criticized for not acknowledging that comics show not only female characters with unrealistic body shapes, but also male ones too, where they have like, overly large muscles and things like that. Aurora maintains that the comic books are generally misogynistic, particularly in the front covers, and that body standards for men with huge biceps and rock-hard abs exist to make them look strong and powerful. But for women, she said, they are tweaked to make them look sexy and not necessarily powerful, but like somewhat even weak. People deem the body types of real-life athletes, like strong women, people like Serena Williams, that they're too masculine. And so that's also an issue. And if creators wanted to make superheroes look strong, they have plenty of real life inspiration to choose from, because there are a lot of really, really strong women out there, and it's not necessarily because of their sexual body, body attributes. So I think that this kind of says it all. And I really like the way she puts it out there. So check your privilege, true believers. My self-righteous indignation knows no bounds. Okay, so let's move on. So creativity. Truth be told, women are not interested in covers that feature a huge group of characters, all of them male. When it comes to simple visual elements, everyone is generally turned off by poorly executed work that feels hurried or ill-considered, and often overly fussy work with no clear focus. So too many unnecessary lines are not good. Ideas that feel like they're overcompensation and insecurity also are not good. So let's take a look here at this next one. And this is some really creative covers. So here we have Daredevil. It's so hard, especially when dealing with all the different comic books that are out there, to like express something really creative in such a small space. It's an 8.5 by 11 space. And artists create covers every week that are amazing, and it's really hard to pick what's good and what's not good. And there's just so many, so it's, forgive me if I only have a few here. But simply visual, simply emotional, frequently both, covers really go an extra mile, making you think or smile or be horrified. Whatever their goal is, I feel like I'm constantly impressed by what cover artists' abilities are and how they try to reinvent the wheel regularly. And so here we can see some just awesome covers. The Daredevil Reborn, with he's kind of like the body outline, but it's hooked up to this dynamite. Magus, with the world sort of falling apart around him, and there he is with his, teddy bear just sort of looking on. Mind Management, Matt Kind, you can see all the different images, like the snake in her hair and all of the different things that he's trying to portray in terms of what's happening. And the Daredevil as well, with this sort of looks like might be a city, but it's really just all these words like that are kind of telling about what's going on. So I think there's just so many ways that you can create a very, very exciting cover. And then there's an area we haven't talked about, and that's comedy and cuteness, which is another area of comic covers. So not every book is great for a comedic cover. So sometimes we have to really think about like what is the content of our book and how comedic do we want to be. But here we have some different examples, and sometimes they're funny, but sometimes they're like really meant to be somewhat satirical. So the cover that can make people chuckle is pretty much worth a weight in gold. Like that pretty much is going to get somebody to open the book. So like here we have Angel and Faith meets Archie Comics. Simple visual jokes like Jeff Darrow's Deadpool fighting a dinosaur that seems to be vomiting kittens. It's like, okay, right? Old school subtlety, but hilarious actual joke on covers like Excalibur. So just different things. And then solitary characters. So a lot of times if your comic book's about one character, you'll see covers with just that character on the cover. So the single character cover, at the end of the day, characters are what comics are all about. So those standalone covers make it just, make the work just on the basis of a single character. They often strike a tone with me. Even better is when they're all crazy, bold, or controversial. Think Frank Quietly's Emma Frost new X-Men cover. But to be honest, if you are entranced, whether they show something unexpected or unique, shining a light on something I don't know about a character, or when they simply capture with perfection what I already did know and love about that character, that's, pretty much what makes that cover really great. So like the Superboy and the Supergirl, those, obviously we love those characters and we want to see them. Like I said, the X-Men Legacy, awesome cover. Just some really great stuff. So choices, bold choices, sure colors, composition are key. But let's face it, what helps you sit up and take notice more than a bold cover, a striking color choice, a heroine shown half normal and half stripped down to the bone, literally, the simplicity of just black shadows, headless cartoon women, which you'd think I'd be against, but not when they're done right, or buried heroes, or heroes jumping into the gaping mouths of a living island. Whatever it is, unconventional is good. It's fresh, and it's new, and it's exciting to see artists, both new and old, pushing this form. These covers aren't always going to be for everyone, but they tend to be pretty cool. So again, some really interesting, ways of thinking about your cover. I love the Glory, where the teeth are just so large and then there's this small character that has to overcome it. Batwoman under the X-ray, literally, with her bones kind of coming through. The Zombie, where it's just like we see her underground, there's this very small amount of color at the bottom, and then her name, the name of the comic book, Zombie, but iZombie. But also then you like pick up as a secondary hierarchy, you start to see the skyline of the cemetery, and the X-Men. So again, not like moving away from some of the branding that we saw with the X-Men earlier, but really great stuff. I hope that sort of helps you like start a dialogue about what your comic book cover is going to look like. And don't forget that is one of our last drop boxes that's left, is your ideas for a comic book cover. And I'm hoping that you can give me at least 2 different ideas. You can hand draw them. You can start to work them up in Illustrator, whatever's clever. But I think that getting ideas down on paper matters. And